Wairarapa Moana goes back through my whakapapa. It's very much part of who I am and my identity as Māori. We were brought up to believe that it was sold, that our people sold Wairarapa Moana for £2,000 and a reserve, which is wrong. It's quite wrong. In fact, it was a gift, and it was referred to then as a Tuku Rangatira, a chiefly gift. In the 1840s, as people were arriving in Wellington, expecting to see farmland, they eventually made their way over to Wairarapa. At that time, our people welcomed settlers into their fold and were willing to lease their land. So it was a perfect match in a way. It was beneficial economy for them and also for the settlers who were able to raise their stock. But the idea of Māori retaining their lands was not something that the government, the Crown, had in mind. As we know from elsewhere, they were willing to go to war, to provoke a war over it. But here in the Wairarapa, the government convinced our people that they were going to get all these benefits from giving up large tracts of land. And even though initially they were reluctant because they were doing quite well under a leasehold economy, but they eventually agreed to sell off land. But the lake wasn't one of those assets that they were really willing to part with, at least not at the beginning. Wairarapa Moana was something that was very precious. The lake itself and its resources were something that was given to us by the atua. It was certainly not something that they would want to sell. It was in the 1870s when the Crown was able to get some of our ancestors to agree to give up, rights to the lake and signed a deed. But then that was repudiated by others, including Pearse. Our tīpuna led that opposition. In order to be recognised as having legal title, they had to go through a court case. Oh, it sounds like a nightmare. The Mackay Commission of Inquiry was quite clear that the Crown narrow approach to ownership was not right. They were able to establish that there was a lot more people who needed to be considered when looking at the ownership of the lake than the mere, 12 or 14 or something people that they had there. So there was in excess of 100 people altogether who was determined had ownership of the lake through the Native Land Court. And as far as Pearse is concerned, he wasn't, a major player in that period. The area of Wairarapa Moana, it was his home. He came from down there, whereas a lot of the people who actually came to Wairarapa Moana for whether it be food resources or other things, came from elsewhere in the Wairarapa. So they travelled, whereas Pearse was right there. That was his home. He certainly wasn't the only one who was involved in that struggle for traditional values to be the primary determinant of how the lake was to be managed, how Wairarapa Moana was to be managed. As his descendants, we feel very proud of our tīpuna Pearse, what he endeavoured to achieve and what he fought for when it came to not being willing to give up on the fight for Wairarapa Moana, whether it be the Crown trying to select a few people to buy it from, or whether it be to protect the natural environment. We feel really, really proud. Within 6 months of his passing, we have the hui at Papua in 1896, and the transition of the lake to the Crown. There's a photo of Papua and the marae when this transaction happened, when the lake was given up to the Crown. The native land court sat at Papua at the front of the meeting house, and it's got all these people sitting and standing around and the judge. It also says that the lake was sold, or words to that effect. So what we found out, and this is only recent, we're talking about 2000 for certain, and what the Crown has accepted, what the Waitangi Tribunal, their report is recognition of the fact that the lake was a gift, and to learn that it wasn't actually sold. In a way, I think, thinking about our tīpuna, Piripita Māori, I sort of think that gives credit to the work that he had done. And it was referred to then by Seddon, Tamahau Mahupuku, who were the main people who negotiated, and it was referred to as a chiefly gift, or a tuku rangatira. Seddon spoke very soon after that day of the transaction and made it very clear that the lake wasn't sold, it was simply given as a chiefly gift, and that our people would retain all the customary rights that they had before. So that was not going to change. His words were very solemn, and they would have been, to our people, they would take him at his word that the Acclimatisation Society would not be introducing any of their fish into the lake, and you will carry on using it for your customary purposes, forever. So this was the sense in which the lake was given and it was received. For me, myself, as a descendant of Piripita Māori, thought that there was quite a betrayal to begin with, that this lake had been just gone like that, within 6 months of our tīpuna passing away. But in fact, there were the important values that were associated with that were retained in what was done. The reserve, the land we ended up with at Pauakani, the reserve was initially the idea that we would have a piece of land somewhere around the lake where our people had traditionally gone fishing, and there was a certain amount of money that was allocated towards that. It wasn't enough to pay for anything substantial, but the reserve initially was for land within that alienated area, within that gifted area. We were to get some land back. The value of that land became very expensive. There wasn't sufficient money for that, for anything of any worth. It was meant to have been some land around the lake, but we ended up with, you couldn't get much further away from it than the middle of the King Country. The bed of the lake is now being given back by the Crown under our treaty settlement, together with a co-government statutory management board that will not only be looking at the close confines of the lake itself, but at the whole catchment. The statutory board is made up of 50% iwi, both Kahungunu and Rangitani, and 50% Crown, being Department of Conservation, Greater Wellington Regional Council and the local district council. And in fact, Ngāti Kahungunu will have the permanent chair of that statutory board. To begin with, there will be a reserves management plan which will be put together by ourselves and DOC for the reserves, and there will also be a wider catchment plan that is going to be facilitated by the Greater Wellington Regional Council, which will get us started with where we want to go. But given the lack of Māori iwi values that have comes through in the management of whether it be the lake or the waterways or associated waterways. It's important that we do this properly, and we try to make a real difference for the future of Wairarapa Māori.